Synopsis of Lesson 18. Psychic influence at a distance. Psychic influence over others, manifested when they are distant from the person exerting the influence. Distance no obstacle. Psychic induction at long range. How to create the en rapport condition with the other person. How to protect yourself against such influence at a distance. The psychic armor. Psychometric method of producing distant en rapport condition. To proceed when the en rapport condition is secured. The scientific explanation of the old tales about sorcery, witchcraft, supernatural influence, etc. The effect of fear and belief on the mind of the other person. The effect of denial. The secret of many strange cases was made plain. Some typical cases. The master key which unlocks the doors of many mysteries. Low forms of occultism, and how they may be defeated. Dangerous teachings in some quarters. Warnings against their use. The Astral Tube. How it is erected, used and employed. A simple, plain explanation of a puzzling occult manifestation. Self-protection. Lesson 18. Psychic influence at a distance. The second phase of psychic influence is that called distant psychic influence, in which psychic induction is manifested when the persons are distant in space from one another, not in the presence of each other. Here, of course, we see the principle of telepathy involved in connection with the process of mental induction, and in some cases even the astral telepathic sense is called into operation. The student who has followed my explanation and course of reasoning in the preceding lessons will readily perceive that the principle involved in this distant phase of psychic influence is precisely the same as that employed in direct personal psychic influence. As I have explained in an early lesson, it matters little whether the space to be covered by the psychic vibratory waves is but 1 foot or 1,000 miles. The principle is exactly the same. There are, of course, other principles involved in the case of two persons meeting face to face and calling into force their psychic powers. For instance, there is the element of suggestion and association, and other psychological principles which are not in force when the two persons are out of the actual presence of each other. But so far as the telepathic or astral psychic powers are concerned, the mere extension of space does not change the principle. The student who has developed his power of psychic induction in the phases mentioned in the preceding chapter, may begin to experiment and practice psychic induction at long range, if he so wishes. That is to say, instead of causing psychic induction in the minds of persons actually in his presence and sight, he may produce similar results in persons out of his sight and presence. The person may be brought into presence and psychic contact, for all practical purposes, by using the visualizing powers for the purpose of bringing him into the en rapport condition. That is to say, by using the imagination to bring into the mind a strong clear picture of the other person, you may induce an en rapport condition in which he will be practically in the same psychic relation to you as if he were actually before you. Of course, if he is sufficiently well informed regarding occult matters, he may shut you out by drawing a psychic circle around himself which you cannot penetrate, or by surrounding himself with psychic armor or atmosphere such as I have already mentioned in preceding lessons. But as he will not likely know anything of this, the average person may be reached in the manner just mentioned. Or again, you may establish en rapport conditions by psychometric methods, by holding to your forehead an article which has been in the other person's possession for some time, an article worn by him, a piece of his hair, etc. Or, again, You may use the crystal to bring up his astral vision before you. Or, again, you may erect an astral tube, such as I will mention a little further on in this chapter, and thus establish a strong en rapport condition. Having established the en rapport condition with the other person, and having thus practically brought him into your presence, psychically speaking, you may proceed to send him commands or demands, just as you did in the phase of personal psychic influence previously mentioned. You act precisely as if the other person were present before you, and state your commands or demands to him just as you would were he seated or standing in your presence. This is the keynote of the whole thing. The rest is simply an elaboration and stating of details of methods, etc. With the correct principle once established, you may apply the same according to your own wishes and discretion. This phase of distant psychic influence is at the bottom of all the wonderful tales, stories and legends of supernatural powers, witchcraft, sorcery, etc., with which the pages of history are filled. There is of course always to be found much distortion and exaggeration in these legends and tales, but they have truth at the bottom of them. In this connection, let me call your attention to a very important psychic principle involved. I have told you that by denying the power of any person over you, you practically neutralize his psychic power. The stronger and more positive your belief in your immunity, and your denial of his power over you, the more do you rob him of any such power. The average person, not knowing this, is more or less passive to psychic influences of other persons, and may be affected by them to a greater or less extent, depending upon the psychic development of the person seeking to influence him. At the extreme of the sensitive pole of psychic influence, we find those persons who believe firmly that the other person has power over them, and who are more or less afraid of him. This belief and fear acts to make them particularly sensitive and impressionable, and easily affected by his psychic induction. This is the reason that the so-called witches and sorcerers and others of evil repute have been able to acquire such a power over their victims, and to cause so much trouble. The secret is that the victims believed in the power of the other person, and feared their power. The greater the belief in, and fear of, the power of the person, the greater the susceptibility to his influence, the greater the sense of power of neutralizing the power, and the disbelief in his power to affect them, the greater the degree of immunity. This is the rule. Accordingly, we find that persons in various stages of the history of the world have been affected by the influences of witches, sorcerers, and other unprincipled persons. In most cases, these so-called witches and sorcerers themselves were under the delusion that they were assisted by the devil or some other supernatural being. They did not realize that they were simply using perfectly natural methods, and employing perfectly natural forces. For that matter, you must remember that magnetism and electricity, in ancient days, were considered as supernatural forces in some way connected with demonic powers. Studying the history of witchcraft, sorcery, black magic, and the like, you will find that the devotees thereof usually employed some psychometric method. In other cases, they would mold little figures of clay, or of wax, in the general shape and appearance of the person whom they wished to affect. It was thought that these little figures were endowed with some supernatural powers or attributes, but of course this was mere superstition. The whole power of these little figures arose from the fact that they aided the imagination of the spell worker in forming a mental image of the person sought to be influenced, and thus established a strong en rapport condition. Added to this, You must remember that the fear and belief of the public greatly aided the spell worker and increased his power and influence over these poor persons. I will give you a typical case, taken from an old German book, which thoroughly illustrates the principles involved in cases of this kind. Understand this case, and you will have the secret and working principle of them all. The story is told by an eminent German physician of the last century. He relates that he was consulted by one of his patients, a wealthy farmer living nearby. The farmer complained that he was disturbed every night by strange noises which sounded like someone pounding iron. The disturbances occurred between the hours of 10 o'clock and midnight, each and every night. The physician asked him if he suspected anyone of causing the strange trouble. The farmer answered that he suspected an old enemy of his, an old village blacksmith living several miles away from his farm. It appears that an old long-standing feud between them had broken out afresh, and that the blacksmith had made threats of employing his hex, witchcraft, powers on the old farmer. The blacksmith was reputed to be a sort of hex or male witch, and the farmer believed in his diabolic powers and was very much in fear of them. So you see, the ideal condition for psychic receptivity was present. The physician called on the blacksmith, and took him by surprise, gazing sternly into his eyes, and asked him, "What do you do every night between 10 and 12 o'clock?" The blacksmith, frightened and disturbed, stammered out, "I hammer a bar of iron every night at that time, and all the while I think intently of a bad neighbor of mine who once cheated me out of some money, and I will, at the same time that the noise will disturb his rest, until he will pay me back my money to get peace and quiet." The physician bade him to desist from his evil practices, under threats of dire punishment, and then went to the farmer and made him straighten out the financial dispute between the two. Thereafter, there was no more trouble. So you see, in this case all the necessary elements were present. First, there was the belief of the blacksmith in his own powers. This gave him self-confidence and psychic power. Then there was the belief and fear on the part of the farmer. This made him an easy subject, and very susceptible to psychic induction, etc. Then there was the action of the blacksmith beating the iron. This gave force and clearness to his visualization of the idea he wished to induce in the mind of the other. And, finally, there was his will employed in every stroke, going out in the direction of the concentrated wish and purpose of influencing the farmer. You see, then, that every psychic element was present. It was no wonder that the old farmer was disturbed. Among the Negroes of the South, in America, and among the Hawaiians, we find marked instances of this kind. The Negro voodoo men and women work black magic on those of their race who are superstitious and credulous, and who have a mortal fear of the voodoo. You see, the conditions obtained are much the same as in the case of the German case just cited. Travelers who have visited the countries in which there is a large Negro population have many interesting tales to recite of the terrible workings of these voodoo black magicians. In some cases, sickness and even death is the result. But, mark you this, it is only those who believe in, and fear, the power of the voodoos that are affected. In Hawaii, the kahunas or native magicians are renowned for their power to cause sickness and death to those who have offended them, or to those who have offended some client of the kahuna, and who have hired the latter to prey the enemy to sickness or death. The poor ignorant Hawaiians, believing implicitly in the power of the kahunas, and being in deadly fear of them, are very susceptible to their psychic influence, and naturally fall easy victims, unless they buy of the kahuna, or make peace with their client. White persons living in Hawaii are not affected by the kahunas, for they do not believe in him, nor do they fear them. Unconsciously, but still strongly, they deny the power, and are immune. So, you see, the principle working out here, also. Once you have the master key, you may unlock many doors of mystery which have heretofore been closed to you. We do not have to fall back on cases of witchcraft, however, in order to illustrate this phase of the use of psychic influence for selfish ends. In Europe and America, there are teachers of a low form of occultism who instruct their pupils in the art of producing induced mental states in the minds of others, for purposes of financial gain or other selfish ends. For instance, there is a Western teacher who instructs his pupils to induce desired mental states in prospective customers, or others whom they may wish to influence for selfish reasons. This teacher tells his pupils to imagine your prospective customer, or other person, as seated in a chair before which you are standing. Make the imagined picture as strong as possible, for upon this depends your success. Then proceed to treat this person just as if he were actually present. Concentrate your will upon him, and tell him what you expect to tell him when you meet him. Use all of the arguments that you can think of, and at the same time hold the thought that he must do as you say. Try to imagine him as complying with your wishes in every respect, for this imagining will tend to come true when you really meet the person. This rule may be used not only in the case of prospective customers, but also in the case of persons whom you wish to influence in any way whatsoever. Surely this is a case of employing psychic powers for selfish purposes, if anything is. Again, in Europe and America, particularly in the latter country, we find many persons who have picked up a smattering of occult knowledge by means of some of the many healing cults and organizations which teach the power of thought over physical diseases. In the instruction along the lines of distant mental healing, the student is taught to visualize the patient as strongly and clearly as possible, and to then proceed to make statements of health and strength. The mind of the patient, and that of the healer, cooperate and in many cases work wonderful cures. As you will see in the last lesson of this course, there is great power in the mind to induce healthful vibrations in the mind of others, and the work is a good and worthy one. But, alas, as is so often the case, the good teaching is sometimes perverted, and applied for unworthy and selfish ends. Some of the persons who have picked up the principles of mental healing have discovered that the same power may be used in a bad as well as in a good direction. They accordingly proceed to treat other persons with the object of persuading them to do things calculated to benefit the person using the psychic power. They seek to get these other persons under their psychic influence, and to then take advantage of them in some way or other. I hope that it is practically unnecessary for me to warn my students against evil practices of this kind. I trust that I have not drawn any students of this class to me. In case, however, that some of you may have been, or may be in the future, tempted to use your psychic powers improperly, in this way, I wish to caution and warn you positively against doing so. Outside of the ordinary morality which should prevent you from taking advantage of another person in this way, I wish to say to you that anyone so misusing psychic or astral powers will inevitably bring down upon his head, sooner or later, certain occult astral forces which will prove disastrous to him. He will become involved in the web of his own making, and will suffer greatly. Never by any means allow yourself to be tempted into indulging in any of the practices of black magic, under any form of disguise. You will live to regret it if you do. Employ your powers, when you develop them, for the good of others, or at least, for purely scientific investigation and knowledge. The scientific investigator of this phase of psychic influence will wish to become acquainted with what the occultists call the astral tube. In this phase of the phenomena, you manifest upon the astral plane, rather than upon the physical. The astral form of telepathy is manifested, rather than the ordinary form. While there are a number of technical points involved in the production of the astral tube, I shall endeavor to instruct you regarding its creation and use in as plain words as possible, omitting all reference to technical occult details which would only serve to distract your attention and confuse your mind. The advanced occult student will understand these omitted technicalities without being told of them. The others would not know what was meant by them, if mentioned, in the absence of a long stage of preparatory teaching. After all, the theory is not of so much importance to most of you as are the practical working principles. I ask your careful attention to what I have to say in this subject of the astral tube. The astral tube is formed by the person forming in his imagination, i.e., on the astral plane by means of his imagination or visualizing powers, a tube or small tunnel between himself and the person whom he wishes to influence. He starts by picturing in his mind a whirling vortex, similar to the whirling ring of smoke emitted from a coughing engine, and sometimes by a man smoking a cigar, about 6 inches to 1 foot in diameter. He must will the imagined vortex ring to move forward as if it were actually boring a tunnel through the atmosphere. When the knack of producing this astral tube is acquired, it will be found that the visualized tunnel seems to vibrate with a peculiar intensity, and will seem to be composed of a substance far more subtle than air. Then, at the other end of this astral tube you must picture the other person, the one whom you wish to influence. The person will seem as if viewed through the wrong end of an opera glass. When this condition is gained, there will be found to be a high degree of en rapport between yourself and the other person. The secret consists in the fact that you have really established a form of clairvoyance between yourself and the person. When you have induced this condition, proceed with your mental commands and pictures just as if you were in the presence of the person himself. That is the whole thing in a nutshell.
In order that you may have another viewpoint from which to consider the astral tube, or what corresponds to it, I wish to give you here a little quotation from another writer on the subject, who presents the matter from a somewhat more technical standpoint.
Read this quotation in connection with my own description of the astral tube, and you will form a pretty complete and clear idea of the phenomenon. The writer mentioned says, "It is impossible here to give an exhaustive disquisition on astral physics. All I need say is that it is possible to make in the astral substance a definite connecting line that shall act as a telegraph wire to convey vibrations by means of which all that is going on at the other end of it may be seen. Such a line is established, be it understood, not by a direct projection through space of astral matter, but by such action upon a line, or rather many lines, of particles of that substance that will render them capable of forming a conductor for vibrations of the character required. This preliminary action can be set up in 2 ways, either by the transmission of energy from particle to particle, until the line is formed, or by the use of a force from a higher plane which is capable of acting upon the whole line simultaneously. Of course, this latter method implies far greater development, since it involves the knowledge of, and the power to use, forces of a considerably higher level. Even the simpler and purely astral operation is a difficult one to describe, though quite an easy one to perform. It may be said to partake somewhat of the nature of the magnetization of a bar of steel, for it consists in what we might call the polarization, by an effort of the human will, of a number of astral atoms reaching from the operator to the scene which he wishes to observe. All the atoms thus affected are held for the time being with their axes rigidly parallel to one another, so that they form a kind of temporary tube along which the clairvoyant may look. This method has the disadvantage that the telegraph line is liable to disarrangement or even destruction by any sufficiently strong astral current which happens to cross its path. But if the original creative effort were fairly definite, this would be a contingency of only infrequent occurrence. The view of a distant scene obtained by means of this astral current is in many ways not unlike that seen through a telescope. Human figures usually appear very small, like those on a distant stage, but in spite of their diminutive size they are as clear as though they were close by. Sometimes it is possible by this means to hear what is said as well as to see what is done, but as in the majority of cases this does not happen, we must consider it rather as the manifestation of an additional power than as a necessary corollary of the faculty of sight. I would feel that I had not done my whole duty to the student, or reader of this book, were I to conclude this chapter without pointing out a means of protection against the use of this phase of psychic influence against him on the part of some unscrupulous person, or for that matter, against the meddling influence of any person whatsoever, for any purpose whatsoever, without one's permission and consent. Therefore, I wish now to point out the general principles of self-protection or defense against this class of psychic influence. In the first place, you must, of course, refuse to admit to your mind any feeling of fear regarding the influence of other persons, for that is the open door to their influence, as I have pointed out to you. If you have been, or are fearful of any person's psychic influence, you must get to work and drive out that feeling by positive and vigorous denials. The denial, you remember, is the positive neutralizer of the psychic influence of another person, providing you make it in full belief of its truth. You must take the position, which is a true one, that you are immune to the psychic attack or influence. You should say, mentally, I deny to any person the power to influence me psychically without my consent. I am positive to all such influences, and they are negative to me. I neutralize them by this denial.
If you feel sudden impulses to act in some way which you have not thought of doing, or toward which you have had an aversion, pause a moment and say, mentally, if this is an outside influence, I deny its power over me. I deny it, and send it back to its sender, to his defeat and confusion.
You will then experience a feeling of relief and freedom. In such cases you may frequently be approached later on by the person who would have been most benefited by your action. He will appear surprised when you turn him down, and will act in a confused way. He may not have consciously tried to influence you, but may have merely been wishing strongly that you would do as he desired. It should encourage you to know that it requires much less force to repel and neutralize psychic influence of this kind, than is required to send forth the power. An ounce of denial and protection overcomes a pound of psychic attacking power. Nature gives you the means of protection, and gives you the best end of the stick, and it is your own fault if you do not effectively use it. A word to the wise is sufficient.